Well, welcome to Black History Conversations. It's great to have a lovely crowd here, and we've just been introducing ourselves to one another and catching up with our friends. So it's been really lovely. So today I'm just going to share my screen so that you can see what we're doing today. We've got Dr. Richard Anderson, who's a lecturer in history at the University of Aberdeen. So he's going to tell us about his work and the Shad Biographies project, which is fascinating. So I'm just going to recognise and acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I'm currently living. I'm actually in Melbourne, just outside Melbourne in Australia. Our local community are the Wurundjeri of the Kulin Nation. So I acknowledge as traditional owners the Wurundjeri people, their elders, past, present and future. This land belongs to the sovereign people of the First Nations, and it was never ceded. It always was, and it always will be their land. Here in Australia, at the beginning of every meeting, there is an acknowledgement of country. If we have colleagues who are from the First Nations, then they would be the people to do the recognition of country. But as I'm here, I acknowledge the country. And I just thought I'd share something else. This was something called Eureka Street. Okay, so we've got our parrots and our wombats and our kangaroos and our possums and the odd snake. You want the bad news or the bad news? Well, it's not been a particularly good week, has it? So I thought I'd just share that. I've also, especially for Richard, included this because Richard spoke to us about the return of a Benin bronze from Aberdeen University. I might want to say a bit more about that. But the Smithsonian now is announcing a landmark decision to repatriate Benin bronzes. Things are really, things have been different, haven't they? And recently I mentioned that the Smithsonian has also returned the bones of people the bones of people, you hear what I said? They've returned the bones of first Australians that they took from their burial places, and they've been returned here to Australia. There was a fascinating film about it recently on RTV. Hilary Robertson Hickling reminded us on, or reminded me on Facebook that Thursday the 10th of March, 200th anniversary of the birth of Harriet Tubman. So I wanted to recognise that. She was a freedom fighter and the person best known for her work in the Underground Railway, and there's been quite a lot of information around and about that. But now we're going to pass over to Richard Anderson because he's written an amazing paper about uncovering the testimonies of slavery and the slave trade in missionary sources and the story of SHADD. I've done a little bit of research about this and I found it absolutely fascinating so far. So I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to say over to you, Richard, and thank you so much. It's fairly short notice to come and speak with us, but I'm really, really grateful. Thank you.
That's great, Liz. Thank you for the introduction. I'm going to try to share my screen. It's been a little while since I've done this, but as I say, we're kind of a small group, so I'm going to keep it relatively short and informal, partly because my voice is going a bit from recording lectures. And so we'll see what we can do. And if I can go to the beginning. Can you see me and can you see the PowerPoint?
We can, you can make it larger if you want.
I'm going to see if I can do that, yeah. You can see just how crammed my desktop is. It's that time of the academic year. And so Liz had asked me to speak today about a paper that I published in 2017, and it was based on a project which I was involved in Canada called the Shad Biographies project. And it's led to, among other things, a website called Freedom Narratives that I'll talk more about at the end. And it was a collaborative research project based at York University in Toronto, Canada, actually what's known as the Harriet Tubman Research Center for the Study of Africa and its diasporas. It's kind of our leading research center in Canada, and is named in honor of Harriet Tubman, obviously based on the strong connections with Ontario, Canada, and the Underground Railroad. And the project Shad is an acronym, but it was also named after a woman named Mary Ann Shad, who was a Black newspaper owner in what was then Upper Canada in the 19th century. So kind of considering the history of publication and abolitionism in Canada in this period. So the Shad Project and the Freedom Narratives website is a project that focuses on narratives of slavery and the slave trade. For historians and for students and the general public, these are incredibly valuable sources. They provide firsthand accounts of pre-colonial Africa and experiences of the slave ship. So these are sources that can help us uncover the means by which African people came to be enslaved, the routes over which they were forcibly moved. But I think equally important, what they do, which other sources don't, is that they really elucidate the experiences of separation from family and the anguish and uncertainty of alien surroundings. And at times, very personal accounts also provide larger insights into larger historical forces and processes of politics and warfare. And so they can offer unique glimpses in a broader history of pre-colonial Africa. But these are also sources that until recently, historians have generally considered to be quite rare. You can see that there are many large compendiums of what are known as slave narratives, but most of these were written or dictated by people who were born into slavery in the Americas. So for example, probably the most famous is the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass. But by comparison, there are comparatively few accounts by people who were born free in Africa and who experienced the Middle Passage. So I'm sure many on the call are familiar with the interesting narrative of the life of Olaudah Equiano, which was first published in 1789. But historians and educators have tended to rely on a small number of canonical narratives, such as Equiano's, for research and teaching. So part of the work that historians of Africa and the diaspora are currently undertaking is to research and expand upon the number of known testimonies. So in my own work, and as sort of working alongside larger research projects and book projects, I've transcribed and published several sources. Some of these historians have known about for some time and have utilized in their own work, and some of which have been largely overlooked. And so in my own research, I'd focused on missionary archives and two missionary societies in particular. The first is the Church Missionary Society, or CMS, which operated in many parts of West and also East Africa in the 19th century. So the Church Missionary Society archives are held at the University of Birmingham, and also the Methodist Missionary Society, which operated in many of these same regions at the same time. Their archive is held at the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. So since the 1960s, at least, historians have recognized that missionary archives are an important repository of accounts from Africans who experienced enslavement in Africa and sailed to Europeans on the coast. Part of that is compared to, say, colonial archives. A much larger percentage of the documents are written by Africans rather than Europeans, partly due to the reliance in the 19th century on African converts within the mission. So for example, one of the best known accounts of enslavement in West Africa is that of Samuel Crowther, who's pictured here, was born in what became Nigeria and later became the first African bishop of the Church of England. So part of my work has been to show that there is a far greater number of life histories in these archives than was previously assumed. Mission stations in West and East Africa drew in formerly enslaved people, and many of them subsequently wrote or dictated accounts of their experiences of enslavement, liberation, and then eventual conversion. And so most of the accounts that I've studied are those of people who are known as liberated Africans. And so liberated Africans was a legal designation for Africans emancipated in the 19th century from slave ships intercepted by the Royal Navy off the African coast. This was after Britain's 1807 Act for the abolition of the slave trade. So following the 1807 Act, the British Royal Navy patrolled both the Atlantic and Indian Oceans in order to suppress the external trade from Africa. And captured vessels were taken to a series of ports around the Atlantic world in places like Freetown, Sierra Leone, Rio de Janeiro, also on St. Helena in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, and also places like Port Louis, Mauritius in the Indian Ocean. And so based on current estimates, between 1808 and 1896, at least 200,000 people were emancipated via this process. It became known as liberated Africans. Perhaps 75,000 of these were settled in Sierra Leone, which was really the epicenter of Britain's campaign against the slave trade. Though I won't be talking about Guyana today, I'll just mention, based on what others work on, is that at least 13,000 liberated Africans were also sent to Guyana during this period. And so this is really a history of people who are captured at sea from slave vessels and then are taken to various locations around the Indian Ocean and the Atlantic as well. And so these were people that were taken from slave ships that in the Atlantic were originally destined primarily for Cuba or Brazil, that is, places where the slave trade continued well into the 19th century. And in the Indian Ocean, they were often destined for the Arabian Peninsula, Persian Gulf, and India. And so we can consider that these were people who were intercepted at sea. They were then taken normally to a British colony. And so in some ways, their history of the Middle Passage was quite different insofar as that they were diverted to a different destination than slave societies in the Americas or in Asia. But at the same time, they were like people who reached those destinations. They were subjected to weeks of disease, cramped conditions, and uncertainty as they were forcibly moved around the Atlantic or Indian Ocean. And so many liberated Africans, especially those who subsequently converted to Christianity at various points in their life, wrote accounts of their enslavement, liberation, and conversion. And in many other cases, missionaries also recorded accounts that were spoken to them. So there was a policy, especially in places like Sierra Leone and the Gambia, where several thousand liberated Africans were sent from Sierra Leone, of educating young liberated Africans in missionary schools. And Christine White, who's with us today, is doing a project especially on the experiences of liberated African children globally and in many of these mission schools. So liberated Africans in missionary schools were established in Sierra Leone, the Gambia, and also in India, where there was an institution that was founded for those that were intercepted in the Indian Ocean and were placed in a CMS school in Sharanpur. And so many of these formerly enslaved people, especially men in particular, had a high level of literacy, and many attained, levels of literacy means that sort of proportionately, there are many more accounts from liberated Africans than there are generally around the African diaspora. And also one thing I'll return to is that over time, missions spread into regions of Africa where these people were born, where they were enslaved, particularly in what is present-day Nigeria. And so many of these people actually returned back to their homelands. And we see a different form of narrative develop then when people are surrounded by areas that they knew from their childhood, and that prompts them to recollect further about their experiences years and decades before. So I'm in the process of compiling a book that looks at about 30 of these narratives. And one thing that's interesting is when we look at them comparatively, there's concentrations in terms of when they appear, that is the dates they're written, and in some cases published, and also geographic concentration. So a lot of them are written in the late 1830s, and there seems to be a particularly sort of strong emphasis then on asking converts to write of their experiences. And so a lot of this is to go towards missionary publications in order to get subscriptions within Britain in particular. So the CMS has publications like the Church Missionary Gleaner, which is where Samuel Crowther's account appears. But it's not the case that all of these appear published in print in the 19th century. And even when they do, they often redact passages of the original document that really don't kind of fit the narrative that they're trying to convey. But one consideration is, of course, that these were documents written with a particular form and a particular purpose, often implicitly or explicitly for publication in missionary journals. They're often labeled as conversion statements rather than a slave narrative, though their titles at times often read simply the life of or the experience of. So you can see here one such account is the life and experiences of Joseph Boston May. So Joseph Boston May, this is obviously not his birth name. Many people take on or are given names after their liberation. He was from the area of what is today Western Nigeria, was captured on a slave vessel in the 1830s, brought to Sierra Leone, and then the Gambia. And you can see here, this is really what's quite unique is that we also have a picture of him from much later in life in the 1880s. And so when we look at the history of liberated Africans, one thing that's really quite unique within the history of the slave trade is you can have a narrative of someone's experience and then a picture of what that individual looked like. And so these are, at the same time, they are biographies of enslaved people. They also have sort of some aspects of different genres and different literary traditions, things like spiritual biography, conversion statements, and so forth. And sometimes this shapes the narratives in particular ways. Often then they interpret their life in terms of a particular narrative arc, thinking of this in terms of the broader history of conversion. And so Samuel Crowther, who I'd shown before, speaks of the sad, but I can now say fortunate day in which I was enslaved. And why does he say that? Well, it is because he was enslaved and then captured. He was brought to Sierra Leone, where he was introduced to Christianity for the first time. So this is not necessarily a sentiment that would be widespread about people, among people who are enslaved in Africa, but you can really see how he looks at his experience through the sort of narrative arc of Christian conversion. And so at the same time, because these are people who are educated in Western schools, they often have a complex relationship between where they are now and the societies into which they were born. And so sometimes they'll refer to their country as, if you can see the text here, it says, I was born in Aku country, a heathen nation, a country full of idolatry. But then at the same time, there's interesting clues in these sources that relate to identity. And so, for example, Joseph Boston May identifies himself as being a member of the Aku Nation, AKU. This is a term that has no meaning in pre-colonial Africa. It's a term that in Sierra Leone becomes a term to identify people who speak the Yoruba language. And so what's interesting is that this is derived from a particular Yoruba greeting. So Yoruba have a number of greetings for the time of day, begin Ekaro, Ekasan, Ekurole, Ekale. And so Aku is sort of a corruption of how the Yoruba people say hello. But in Sierra Leone and elsewhere, this becomes how these people are identified. And this relates to some interesting conversations I've had with David Olson about African nations in the diaspora. People identify in ways based on common languages they didn't necessarily identify with in their homeland. And sometimes the terms that they use have no meanings in their homeland, but they take on new meanings in different places. And so many of the narrators I look at refer to themselves as Aku, that is to say, people who speak various dialects of Yoruba, and that's a point I'll return to in a moment. One thing to consider is we look at these as firsthand accounts of individual experiences. These are accounts that are also shaped by the young age at which many liberated African narrators left their homeland. So the final decades of the slave trade are, to an unprecedented extent, a trade in children. And the Indian Ocean trade always had a very large percentage of captives who were children. Part of this might be due to the fact that the slave trade is going to end. And so there's a sort of acknowledgement that at some point that there will be no more transatlantic slave trade. And so in this period, the 1830s, 40s, 50s, there's a greater percentage of children on board these ships. And so on the one hand, this can in some ways cloud the ability of young people as young as 9 or 10, to really understand the circumstances in which they came to be enslaved, some of the broader sort of political forces that might have impacted their homelands. But at the same time, it means that they were able to attend missionary schools and years later produce accounts such as this. And as we can see in the case of people like Joseph Boston May, lived for several decades beyond the closure of the slave trade in the Atlantic. And one thing that's interesting is that in some cases, what people remember is quite vague, but in some of these sources, there's a tremendous amount of specificity. And this is another transcribed account here by a man who in Sierra Leone took on the name Peter Wilson. Now, as you can see, he also identifies himself as a member of the Aku tribe. So that is, he is a speaker of one particular Yoruba dialect, and was born in a town called Owu, which in the 1820s was completely destroyed. And one thing, if you look down, this is an account that you can see by the wording is secondhand, that is, that it was dictated to somebody who then wrote about Peter Wilson. But there's a tremendous amount of specificity here. He knew that he was on a Portuguese ship. This was captured on the way to Brazil. It was captured by a British vessel named HMS Maidstone. He knows the name of the commander on the ship, and he knows the exact date, the number of days, that is 43-day passage from where he was captured off the coast of what became Nigeria and when he landed in Sierra Leone. So one question is, how does he know this amount of detail? Anybody want to venture a guess?
Was it the weather, the moon, or I don't know.
Well, like there's a tremendous amount of precision here, and I'll say every detail of this is right. The ship name is spelled slightly differently, but these exact dates, the name of the Commodore, the name of the vessel, the number of days, and again, this is something that he is writing several decades later.
Did he keep a diary?
He did, well, yes and no, insofar as many of these accounts are kept in diaries which the CMS asked their converts to keep. But he is referring to written sources, and it's interesting in this case, and he's not the only person to do so, is that he researches his own account. That is to say that you can look at documentation that exists from British anti-slave trade courts that operated in Sierra Leone, and that's where it has specific information on the capture of different vessels. And you see here, it's unlikely that he would have known all of this detail at the time, let alone decades later. So how does he know? And so in this case, my guess is that he goes into these court buildings and is able to research aspects of his life. So it's interesting to consider how this is a combination of a personal reminiscence, but also looking through colonial sources in a particular way.
would someone else perhaps have added that detail and done that research and put it in to suit the narrative they were trying to get from him?
This is possible insofar as this was in the form of a speech given at his funeral and given by his wife, who said that he'd given these details along the way, including what he said is his country name, Leguande. So these are things that are known within the family, but it might be the case that he looked at this, it might be the fact that his wife looked at this, or somebody else within the mission was able to look at these. But in the case of Samuel Crowther, who I began with, his photo, there's that same level of precision. And that's something that's written almost 2 decades later. And so it's interesting to kind of consider how these people are interested in knowing and researching these aspects of their own lives. And so one thing you can see here is that he was born in a particular town called Owu, when I said that this was entirely destroyed in the 1820s. And one thing is, if you look as far as the details allow for where these individuals were born, there is a really high concentration. And so this is a map. I'm sorry, it has a lot of detail. This is what is today Western Nigeria and also the Republic of Benin. So if you look along the coast, you can see Lagos, for example. So modern day Western Nigeria. And really, this is an area of Yoruba-speaking territories, what missionaries from the 1830s and 40s onward would call Yoruba land. And so in the period from the 1810s onward, we see a large number of enslaved people from this territory, partly because what was previously a very large and powerful empire, the Oyo Empire, begins to disintegrate and then collapse. And so what happens is that you then have a period that's often referred to as Yoruba civil wars of different polities and communities fighting amongst themselves. And alongside that, there is pressure from an Islamic jihad movement from the north. And so really by the 1810s, 20s, and 30s, a lot of the enslaved people who are leaving ports like Lagos are Yoruba speakers. And so I've gone through these accounts and I've said, okay, where do these people identify where they're from? And if you look on the map, the locations identified in red are specific place names, places of origin that are mentioned in these texts. And so you can see a really high concentration here, and it really correlates with what we know about the course of the Yoruba Wars, particularly in the 1820s. In some cases, these sources are very good for knowing more about those details, specific years of specific battles when particular places fell. So, for example, on the last map, on the last narrative, we mentioned Owu, which was a town that was located here. And so what happens, as I mentioned, by the 1830s, is that the mission in Sierra Leone becomes a mission also to this region of southern Nigeria. And so it begins with mission stations on the coast at places like Badagry here, which you can see on the coast to the west of Lagos. And then the mission begins moving inland and really establishes itself at a place to the north called Abeokuta, which may not appear on this map, but is sort of inland directly north of Badagry and Lagos. And so what happens is that many liberated Africans begin returning to the places where they were born. And so they're surrounded by places they knew growing up. And Christine is now working on a piece that particularly focuses on reunions. A quite remarkable aspect of this history is that some liberated Africans are able to be reunited with family members. This is an impossibility for most people who are enslaved in Africa. But we can see where they can over time, a select number can meet with family members, their mothers, for example. And again, this becomes a key element of missionary propaganda, but it's also a remarkable story in its own right. And so one such account that's written by a liberated African convert who returns to his place of birth is a man named Thomas King. And so when he returns to what is now Western Nigeria, there's a point where he's alongside a river, and he's prompted to remember the morning of that unhappy day that I was separated from my parents about the year 1825 in the beginning of November. I left home about 8 o'clock for farm about 3 miles distance from home in order to get some corn. My mother and elder sister, about a fortnight previous, went to Ishaga, a town about 14 or 15 miles distance from hence to trade. My niece and I, my sister's daughter, were the little ones that were left at home. I stayed with my family, but my niece was left to care of her father. No sooner had I got to the farm and just cut sufficient corn for my load that the repeated reports of muskets at the town gate acquainted me of my dangerous situation. All my endeavor to escape had utterly proved a failure, as I was surrounded by a number of men who were very eager as to whose lot my capture should fall. At last, as a kid among many chasing wolves, I was caught by one of them. So you can see in some ways this is an account that is published in 1851, and you can see why this might resonate with a Victorian British audience in terms of how this is presented as a tale of a child among wolves. And many of these accounts too were accompanied by images such as this, normally created by somebody who'd never been to Africa, but the caption would be how Thomas King became a slave. And sometimes these images are used for different narratives with different captions, for example. But you can see this is one of several quite lengthy accounts that refer to this particular moment in Yoruba history around the 1820s. And Thomas King is really interesting for two reasons. The first is, again, he is somebody who's able to return to his place of birth where he's reunited with his mother. And I began a chapter of my book with this account. And then after that, when I took the position at Aberdeen, I learned that Thomas's son, Nathaniel, was the first African-born student of the University of Aberdeen in the 1870s. So I think I'll leave it there. I think you've got some sense of what these sources can offer. And I think these are particularly important in terms of how we teach African history. I'd found in my own experience with undergrads being able to focus on the history of individuals and to consider how the experiences of individuals in particular historical settings is a useful way to consider sort of broader historical contexts and processes. And so that brings this question of how we disseminate our research, how we publish our findings. So Liz mentioned at the onset and had found a journal article which I published in 2017. Many of these accounts form part of my own book project and an edited volume that I did. But of course, these are things like journal volumes that are often behind paywalls, books that come out at a certain cost through academic publishers. And so part of the work in this field has been to consider things like digital humanities projects and databases. And so I'll leave here the URL for the Freedom Narratives Project. Really, I think historians a lot now are considering how we make this research and how we make these sources publicly available, how we make that available beyond the university, and particularly thinking about that these are sources that are significant to Sierra Leone, these are sources that are significant for the history of Nigeria, and how to make that as widely available without cost.
Well, that was amazing. Thank you so much. Gosh, I was particularly fascinated that you mentioned Badagry, because I remember as a child, my father was working in Nigeria, and he visited Badagry. I don't think we actually did, but I looked up Badagry, and there's a slave museum there and some really fascinating information about it, and video taking you around the museum for telling it their point of view. But you know, you don't know what people know. So it's unfortunate that Professor Sati from Jos University, which is in Plateau State, isn't with us today, but I'm sure he'll watch this and will comment. And it's great that we've got academics from around the world joining us, as well as colleagues from around the world who are interested in and pursuing aspects of Black history yourselves. So over to others to ask Richard any questions or to raise any points. That was just fascinating.
Yes, hi. Hello there. Yes, so absolutely fantastic. Wow. And it's made me look at the whole thing of the transatlantic slave trade and the end of slavery in a totally different perspective. I actually didn't realize that this happened. It's brilliant.
Mhm.
Very, very good. When I said I didn't realize in such detail, very, very good. I loved it.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Janita? Great to have you with us.
Thank you, Richard. That was amazing. I had two questions, if I could be cheeky and ask two questions. One question I had was about the accounts that the liberated Africans keep, because it sounds very much as if, because they've been part of the missionary system, that they've in a way become so westernized that they may have become divorced in a sense from their own communities, in the sense that they're looking at them as primitive when they're not, but then, you know, so it's almost like they've taken on board Western eyes through which to understand their own societies. So I wondered how useful they were as a source in terms of really getting a viewpoint that was African. I mean, like African as opposed to an African who's been kind of indoctrinated by the missionary system. So that's the first question. And the second question was, I was really interested, you said very briefly at the beginning that 13,000 liberated Africans were sent to Guyana post 1807, I think. And I was just curious as to what happened to those Africans, because if they're in a society where other Africans weren't yet free, how did they survive? Like, what did they do? Because theoretically, if they're liberated, they're having to sell their labor or something. So I just wondered if you could say something about that.
Yeah, I think I might start with the second first. I see
Yep.
June has a hand up, so I'll make sure we do these in order after. I'll take the easy answer insofar as I'd put a link in the chat where I'd written a piece recently for Oxford Research Encyclopedia of African History, focused particularly on the history of liberated Africans, sort of globally, and synthesizing some of the latest research. And so you're absolutely right, where liberated Africans were intercepted at sea. The naval instructions were that they were to be taken to the nearest port that had a court that could adjudicate this particular capture of a vessel. Where people went really shaped their subsequent lives. So in some cases, they'd go to places like Rio de Janeiro, Havana. These are the largest slave societies of the 19th century in the Atlantic world. So they have a legal status that says they're liberated, but really they're in much larger urban slave societies and also plantation societies. And a lot of the research is focused on, particularly in these contexts, about in terms of experience not being that far removed from slavery, insofar as they're supposed to have certain guarantees in terms of this not being sort of a perpetual form of servitude, but most are put into periods of apprenticeship that are most meant to be for periods of 7 to 14 years. In a lot of cases, these are sort of illegally kept in perpetuity. And this is true of places like Guyana. Now, one interesting irony with the case of Guyana is that these are mainly people who first go to Cuba or Brazil. Over time, the British have a lot of misgivings about these people being outside of British territory. They don't trust independent Brazil. They don't trust the Spanish government in Cuba to have any oversight or consideration for these people. And that's why you see populations end up in places like Guyana and Trinidad as well. Now, you can consider that experience would be quite different from, say, Sierra Leone, which is in the 1780s onward designed as a sort of prototypical post-slavery society. Now, it falls well short of that, but the experiences of people are quite different. And that's partly why you see so many more accounts. It's because you have sort of mission settlements built for the education of liberated Africans. We also see this in East Africa slightly later. So by the 1870s, we see sort of the creation of a Sierra Leone of the East Coast at Freiretown, which is near Mombasa on the East African coast. And so you can see where and when these people are disembarked really shapes their experiences and their subsequent lives. So the question you had then about how these people write about their experiences based on the fact that this is a very westernized education for much of their life. They embrace sort of Western Christian ideals. I think we can look at it in two ways. One is in terms of narratives of slavery and the slave trade. And I think probably apart from diction in some ways, you know, playing up these experiences, I don't really see that sort of having a large impact. You know, one thing to consider is that we have these sources for two reasons. One is that the Church Missionary Society asks that mission agents, that is catechists, that is missionaries and so on, they ask them to keep journals. Now we don't have the original journals, but what they did is they produced journal extracts. So they have a daily journal. From that, they would take what they considered to be the most worthwhile or interesting aspects of that journal, and then they would send that to the mission headquarters in London. So it's interesting to consider, okay, are these personal reflections? Is this really a journal, right? Where you're not necessarily concerned about what, you know, the white heads of the mission would consider appropriate or fitting. But at the same time, you can see there's sort of an information process that's gearing towards publication. So I think, you know, you can read it in that particular way. In terms of how they portray African societies, it's quite interesting, where in some ways, as I say, it is derogatory, but at the same time, many of them have an emerging level of respect. So for example, in terms of Yoruba converts, they realize that Yoruba religion is incredibly popular, incredibly enduring in the diaspora. So Yoruba belief is founded around the veneration of what are known as the Orisha. And what they realize is that actually the Orisha are really strongly worshipped among liberated Africans in Sierra Leone, in the Gambia, and so forth. And so you can see just almost a begrudging level of respect. And one thing that changes over time is that, you know, a lot of these people are invested in the mission, invested in the colonial state. By the latter part of the 19th century, there is a pushback by white missionaries, often quite sort of jealous of people like Samuel Crowther, who have these important positions within the missionary hierarchy. And so at some point, that is a period where some African converts really start to see and admire more aspects of Yoruba culture as well.
Thank you.
So it's a complex reading, but it's not, I don't think you can say that because they're entirely educated in a Western tradition, that sort of discounts these as really useful sources for this history.
No, I wasn't thinking it discounted it, but I grew up in Nigeria, and it just something I was very conscious of was that people who had very Western educations quite often separated themselves off from those who weren't. And I should couch this in the sense that my father was a colonial, so you know, not something, you know, I like to sing about, but he was a colonial, and my mother was Ghanaian, and we lived in Nigeria, so we had a very odd kind of upbringing. But one of the things I always found really fascinating was that there were a lot of Yoruba people who lived in the north of Nigeria, who, as a result of their education, kind of kept themselves separate, and just were slightly. Yeah, I don't know. I wish Dr. Sassy was here because he'd probably be able to say it in a better way than I can. But yeah, and I just wondered if that was the case only like in the 50s, 60s, 70s, what it would have been like, particularly because I mean I can remember how missionaries behaved in Nigeria, where everything anybody African or Black did was primitive, was in that context, and therefore a lot of the also the Black people who had been influenced by the missionaries really treated other people very differently, as though they were primitive. That's why I was just kind of curious as to how it would have, how they would talk about other Africans, I guess, in their writing.
Okay. Thanks ever so much, Anita. That's fascinating and such an interesting reflection. Okay, Pauline, you'd got a question.
Yes, yeah. I just wish to thank him. It was very interesting to learn about this, because I never knew about it. So the Liberated Africans, I didn't realize there were so many. And was this the missionary? Their idea was to convert the Africans from their spirituality to the Western way, and they sort of scattered them around to change people's perception and to separate, because of division. I'm just sort of what Janita just said. That's what came to mind, and that's what I can see here, because they would regard the African way of life, their religion, as primitive. So was that the idea, to change the people, to educate these ones to go back into the community and change, the Africans?
I think long term that was sort of an aspiration, insofar as, the CMS begins operating in West Africa beyond Sierra Leone, that is beyond the colony. They're met with very little success. And so beginning in 1816, they turn to Freetown, they turn to the colony and the education of liberated Africans. And so it's quite different from other mission fields in an interesting sort of way, insofar as normally a mission field is defined by saying, okay, here they speak this language, let's learn this language. But at the same time, we have to be there at the behest of local leaders who are willing to accept our presence. So in Sierra Leone, they don't have to do that. This is a British colonial space. There are thousands upon thousands of young people arriving. And so there's this sort of natural population there that they can convert. And as you say, it's very much of that idea of converting them into a Western image. At the same time, there's interesting challenges insofar as in Sierra Leone, they don't speak one language. By some accounts, there are as many as 200 languages spoken among the liberated African population. And so they kind of, on the one hand, they see Sierra Leone as a linguistic laboratory. You can say, okay, let's select the most widely spoken languages among these people. Things like Yoruba, things like Hausa, Igbo. And that becomes really in the mid-century Freetown, it becomes really the basis for the missionary study of language. And so over time, they start to imagine Freetown as a sort of jumping off point. So we can study Yoruba here, and then we can found a Yoruba mission, and we can go in there with a basis of linguistic knowledge that we wouldn't possess otherwise. And one interesting aspect of this is that it's actually African converts who do a lot of the work. So the first Yoruba grammar is written by Samuel Crowther, whose image I began with. And so that's an aspiration over time, but it doesn't immediately present itself, partly because the mission starts very small, and it's something to consider over the course of the 19th century, how this progresses.
Can I just show
Thank you.
This session that we did last November, when we had an author from Lagos? I don't know if you joined this session, Richard, did you?
I couldn't make that. That was
No.
clash with teaching. I was very upset.
Yeah, and it's recorded and posted, and he's preparing his book into the research into Mojola Agbebi,
Yes.
the Nigerian Baptist leader. Does this have any link with what you're talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. And you can see this is a population, they're called the Seros. That becomes a corruption in 19th century Lagos of Sierra Leonean. So it refers especially to these people who are returnees. Now, they're not necessarily all missionaries. They're often traders. They're people who are liberated Africans. One thing you can do in Sierra Leone is that they auction off the old slave ships. And so liberated Africans often band together. It's really quite poetic. They buy an old slave ship and then they start trading, at times with the very port where they were sold as property in years before. But they use these vessels to go to places like Lagos, like Badagry, often alongside the mission. But it's an area along the coast where in this period, Sero is a name for Sierra Leonean returnees.
Fascinating. Thank you very much indeed for that. Thank you, Richard. That was just brilliant. Pauline, was that okay? You're okay with the?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, he did explain it very well. Thank you so much. Thanks.
Right, well, we'll just thank you again, Richard, very much indeed.
Does Juanita have one last? Happy.
Oh, yes.
Sorry, I
Take
just
one
want to
more.
squeeze another one in. I just wanted to ask about the situation in Sierra Leone, because my understanding had always been that the slaves or the enslaved people who were intercepted on the ships by the British and who were returned back to Sierra Leone generally ended up in indentureship for 14 years.
Mm-hmm.
So that wasn't any, it kind of wasn't any different. What I couldn't understand is why weren't they just free if they were sent back to Sierra Leone?
Yeah, no, that's, I mean, it's an excellent question, isn't it? And that's kind of at the core of all of this. And I think it kind of relates to Pauline's point before about sort of an attitude of paternalistic tutelage, right?
Right.
Liberation isn't something that could be granted. Freedom was something that had to be taught. And they believed that, you know, it sort of prefigures emancipation in the British Caribbean, right? Where they also have this system of apprenticeship. An apprenticeship is kind of a metaphor, right? It's this sort of idea that you have to be taught freedom, right? Even if you're cutting cane in a sugar field and you already know how to do that, you've done it your whole life. There's this narrative of you have to be prepared to be free.
But do we know how the people in Sierra Leone, how they kind of accepted those people? I mean, did they become integrated, or were they kind of kept as a separate group in a sense?
They do, because they're often, you know, they're apprenticed to earlier arrivals, you know, earlier settler population. So many people who were at different parts of their lives enslaved as well. And it's also the fact that it's not a plantation society, right? This is a small and growing sort of port community. And so what apprenticeship means is very different than, say, in Havana, where these people are ostensibly apprentices. They just disappear into the sugar growing areas in the hinterland of Havana.
Yes. Hi. Can I just
Marcia, yes.
Yes, hello. Yes, so I'm actually doing some research for Cadbury's, the cocoa, and brilliant question you've asked, Junita. And what I found is that these people would have been kept separate, and they would have kept separate for, basically the answer is cheap labour. So it's how can I put it? The labour still needed to be done, even though slavery had been abolished, and that's where they were. There was cheap labour.
Mm-hmm.
And they weren't really integrated into the rest of the society that they came from. And from my research, I found the reason for that is because they didn't want these liberated people to, how can I put this, get excited about the fact that they were going back to their own people. They were kept separate, and it was a case of control. We don't want you to look at the other free people. Make sure you know that you're here for cheap labour.
Mm.
So,
Thanks, Marcia.
Thank you for that, Marcia. Pauline, have you got a further question?
No, is my hand still up? No, sorry, I'll take it down.
Excuse me, I'm sneezing here. Right, okay, thank you very much indeed.
Excuse me, I did have my hand up. I just wanted to thank you for a wonderful, yes, I did have my hand up previous.
Oh, sorry, June.
Yeah,
Okay.
but that was to thank you for a brilliant presentation. It was very informative and I liked the way you presented it. And I've learnt a lot from that presentation. Thank you very much.
I appreciate that, June. Thank you.
Thank you, June Elizabeth. Thank you very much indeed.
Could I just say something briefly? When I was doing some recently, when at the end, when slavery ended, one of the ideas were in St. Vincent to get labour, basically, on the plantations, was for people to come from Sierra Leone, and also to try and have people who've been taken from captured slave ships and have them brought to work on the plantations on St. Vincent. But on top of that, I was fascinated by the story of this precision with dates that you mentioned in these testimonies and so on, and how that was brought about. I used to be married to a Gambian griot, and he didn't even know when he was born. He had no idea of his birth date. And he used to sing songs, you know, of people who've been taken as slaves. They were, you know, part of what had been passed down through his family. But he didn't know the stories of what had actually happened to them. And he was horrified. We went to see the film Amistad, and he was horrified because that was the first he knew of the reality of what had happened to the people who'd been taken from the Gambia. And they actually had the other strange things, because we went over to Gambia and we went to see his uncle, the chorus. He loved Gambia, his wonderful chorus. And the two ladies there who were sat sort of by the roadside making his chorus. And I asked my husband, well, who were these ladies? And he said, well, these were his uncle's wives, but they also had family slaves because they were griots. Years and years ago, they had been given slaves as, you know, as gifts, I suppose. And so, although they weren't expected to work for them, then at that time, they were expected to provide food for them. So some of the family slaves heard that we were going to see his uncle, and they turned up, and they were expecting to have some money from him. Now, I didn't know, I hadn't thought about slaves belonging to griots. You know, it's obviously very different for their lives now, but they were, the family, even though the family weren't rich, griot families aren't particularly well off, they were expected, you know, to provide food. Although they sat separately, because when he went back once by himself and he took some photographs, and I said, why are these people sitting not with the rest of the family eating the food? He said, well, those are the slaves. They gave them the food, but they didn't sit with them. So there's kind of aspects of this history that are extraordinary. There's a book written by a Leith Quaker, and it's called A Tribute to the Negro. And it was published in 1848. And the people, the stories of Africans that are in it, they all have, you know, it's like you have to be religious to have been included in it. I think it's probably the first book of biographies of Africans that was published, certainly in Britain in 1848. And he has great respect for the history of Africans, you can tell. At the beginning, Wilson Armistead, but all these people whose biographies are in, they all, you know, had become Christians, and it's like that's how you get to be in the book, really. And that's, I suppose, it's easier way through the missions. I don't know how they got hold of all these biographies, but you know, that must be connected to the research that you've been doing over the mission societies and so on, and how Christianity is spread in Africa.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of really interesting related points there. One is sort of different forms of memory, and you mentioned sort of oral recollections. You know, I'm working with written documents. It's interesting to consider how these coincide, where I'd had, I think, limited success in Freetown talking to people about their ancestors and what they knew of family history. I think that's partly because, you know, Freetown's history in the 1990s through the early 2000s was incredibly disruptive. I know, for example, that some of these Sero communities in places like Lagos will have a much stronger idea of their sort of family ancestry. And alongside that, you can look at other sources where sometimes these churches, you can go to a church in Lagos, you can see a memorial on the wall where there'll be details of this.
Cover it up. Yeah, bring it up, though.
But at the same time, it's interesting where there's a historian, Chantal George, who's Christine's colleague at Glasgow, and has done oral histories among liberated African descendant communities in Grenada. And so they were often settled into villages. And we also see this in Sierra Leone, where specific villages for freed people that don't exist in, say, Brazil. And And 200 years later, you can go to those villages and people are aware that their ancestors came to the island as freed people, not enslaved people. So there's that sort of diaspora consciousness. At the same time, I say that these are narratives written by people who tend to arrive in Sierra Leone in the 1810s, 1820s, because what happens is that after there's abolition in the British Caribbean, a lot of the people that arrive in Sierra Leone, including children, are just immediately sent to the Caribbean. There's a perceived labor shortage. And so there's this sort of, liberated African policy it doesn't have a moral arc that bends towards actually liberating these people. If anything, it goes in the opposite direction, where by the 1830s, 40s, and later on, it's really about control of labor. And that's why you don't have accounts from later on in the Atlantic, because these people are not being sent to school. They're being sent to the British Caribbean to work.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Janita, you've got another query then. We just need to
yeah, sorry, Liz. I hope you don't mind. I don't know if we've got something else to move on to. But I had 2 points I guess I wanted to make. One was just in response to what Alison said. I thought that was really interesting that you were mentioning about your griot partner not, did you say he didn't know when his birthday?
He didn't know. He didn't know how old he was.
Yeah. And I just thought that was really interesting because my mother never knew her birthday either. And she always used to think this Western obsession with dates was just ridiculous. But I thought that was really one of the things I was trying to say earlier to Richard, was because like the obsession with dates is like signaling your level of civilization. I mean, that's why I'm kind of interested in like how much of it says that you're African, because my mother was born when 1930s. So, and she couldn't care less. And the other thing she couldn't care about was kind of also pointed to this issue of the problem with missionaries, is that her name, her sort of private name was Asi Nkokobio, which means the one that never leaves. So she'd been here forever, in terms of her society's understanding, and that she'd been someone who just came back, she dies, she comes back. So the kind of thing with dates I thought was really fascinating, Alison. But the thing I wanted to just pick up and ask you about, Richard, was this thing to do with when they intercepted the ships, didn't other Europeans see this as some form of hypocrisy? Because none of these people are being taken into freedom, they're being taken into labor elsewhere, and the British are the ones benefiting from it. I'm just thinking, like, why wasn't everybody else up in arms about it from the European perspective?
To an extent they were. Okay. A lot of this comes through sort of bilateral treaties at the conclusion of the Napoleonic Wars, and Britain essentially strong arms whoever they can. And that is those that they have a position of power over. The Portuguese, the Spanish, the French won't agree. The United States won't agree to anything that's an entangling sort of treaty, that allows mutual seizure, for example. But it's essentially an element of strong arming. So, for example, it becomes an element of Britain recognizing the independence of Brazil in the 1820s, saying you have to sign this treaty. It's a continuation of the Portuguese treaty, but if you adhere to this, we'll recognize your independence and sovereignty. And the British, so there are resentments, and especially there's a lot of resentment in Spain, but especially in mid-19th century Brazil. So the British force Brazil to pass the Slave Trade Act in 1831. 200 years later, they say para inglês ver, which means for English eyes, or one for the English. So they're not going to enforce this at all. And they're quite resentful of the fact that they have to put this in writing because the British say they do. But you can kind of see there's this element of begrudgingly going along with these.
So it's really interesting that the British managed to build this idea of emancipation into something that was so moral, when clearly everybody's aware it's got nothing to do with morality.
Yes, excuse me, but Richard, to add on to what Juliana was saying, there was a royal company, wasn't there, that controlled, there was like a royal company in the African slave
The Royal
information.
African Company.
Yeah, the Royal
Yes.
African Company, and that belonged to the Queen, the King. Yeah.
Loads of rich people and the royalty.
No,
They've
yeah,
got the
you know,
stake in that.
yeah, they got a stamp
Elizabeth,
about
I
it,
think we
didn't
could
they?
probably do a whole session on the Royal Africa Company.
Absolutely.
We'll ask for a volunteer who wants to tell us about that one week, and I'm going to ask for volunteers in a bit. So, okay, June Elizabeth, thanks very much indeed. I think it's too big a subject for us to follow now, but thank you very much for that point. And thank you very much again, Richard. I'm just going to whiz through the things that are going on and I wanted to share with you. And then after we've wound up the recording, I'm sure there'll be lots of opportunities to ask further questions. Simon says we're okay for time. Okay, so I'm just going to quickly move on then. And also in the article that I managed to find that Richard had written in 2017, he also talked about the studies in the history of the African diaspora documents. And I found that really very interesting, Richard, and I won't ask you to speak about it now, but I think it would be something that you know, people may want to look up themselves and find out more about, and the stories of these first-hand narratives.
Yeah, sorry, I'll put the link in the chat, because unfortunately,
Okay.
one of the pitfalls of doing this sort of aspect of digital history, especially if you change institutions, is that, you know, links become old. Sometimes the information's not there. So let me
thank you very much indeed. That's really helpful. And it was interesting, this story, the story of Mary Ann Shad Carey. And she and this plaque explains that African Americans came to Canada in increasing numbers after the United States passed the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850. And some settled in segregated communities, and others, like Mary Ann Shad, promoted full integration into society. As teacher and anti-slavery crusader, Shad immigrated to Windsor in 1851, and she started the Provincial Freeman in 1853 to encourage Blacks to seek equality through education and self-reliance. So presumably that was a newspaper. 2 years later, she moved to the newspaper to Chatham, where it operated for the rest of the decade. She was widowed in 1860, then returned to the US, 1863, working on racial equality in the aftermath of emancipation. So she was the first Black woman known to have edited a North American newspaper. So when I talked earlier about, you know, the links, countries' histories, the US has got a different Black history to Canada, and we need to recognise these differences, and then the Indigenous histories as well. So I thought that was worth sharing, and there's more information about her that you can find on the internet. Okay, so this was something else that was posted to me. People send me information, thank you very much indeed, during the week of things they've found, because bear in mind I'm here in Australia, I don't always hear what's going on in the UK around the world. So this architect who's documenting every slaved house that's still standing is a fascinating story to follow up, and I'm sure people might be interested in that. Then looking at South Africa, here on RTV, we've got this series on the anti-apartheid movement, which has been fascinating to watch. So I've just shared that with you. And also I found somebody who was my namesake. I was Elizabeth M. Williams, but this book isn't by me. It's The Politics of Race in Britain and South Africa, and I thought that was particularly interesting. And that Elizabeth Williams works at Goldsmiths, and I thought she might be somebody who might come and talk with us one week. And I'd like to ask if anybody's got any ideas, presentations you might like to make on any aspect of Black history, just let me know and I'll sort things out. Now, this is particularly why I wanted to get through this PowerPoint. This event is going on at 5:30 in the UK today. So it's such a significant event, I think, that it would be great if people want to want to sign up and see if you can still get in on the Zoom. So it's how Europe underdeveloped Africa and the Caribbean, a reparation debate. So we're just going on to the next one. So this year, it's the 50th anniversary of Walter Rodney's groundbreaking book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. And to honour this, Professor Hilary Beckles from the University of the West Indies has published his own book, How Britain Underdeveloped the Caribbean. So it'd be great to get copies of that and read that. Professor Hilary Beckles will join SOAS Director Adam Habib and SOAS President Dinab Badawi for a lively debate on the book and also the issue of global reparations. So it should be a really fascinating session. So I shall get up at 5:30 in the morning and see if I can log in. And Zina Badawi also produced the brilliant series on African history. If you haven't begun to look at that and you want more information, that's absolutely fantastic. I don't know how many episodes there are, but it's really, really well worth dipping in and out of. Okay, so that's that information. So in order to get into this, we've got the Eventbrite, oops, a daisy, got the Eventbrite link there. So if I cut and paste that, I'll put it into the chat in a couple of minutes, all right? All right, then on to, this was great. Here, I was doing some research to see what had been going on in the research into the histories of African stories in Hull and East Yorkshire. And there's a great website, so I wanted to include that here, africansinyorkshireproject.com. Done quite some time ago, but absolutely excellent, groundbreaking in terms of local Black history projects. I wanted to respect that. Now we go on to Wales, so we swing around. So children across Wales are to learn about Betty Campbell in a new play. Betty Campbell was Wales's first Black head teacher and champion of multiculturalism. And there's a new play starting this week. So this was Wales Arts Council. So as many of you know, there's lots of good stuff been going on in Wales.
I think there's just been a statue made to her, hasn't there?
Yes, there has. Yes,
Yeah.
so, well, that was unveiled some little while ago, and also the BBC have got a podcast series on now called "The Museums That Make Us," and I can see this from here, which is good. Some of the BBC stuff gets blocked. So this new series for Radio 4 celebrates museums found in all corners of Britain, and I think it's really interesting about what museums are doing, and it's a fascination to me. And he is looking at answer for the question, what are museums for in 2022? So thank you. I think a couple of people sent me this link. The third programme, he's been in North Wales to see Penrhyn Castle. It's a bit of an obsession with a couple of us, and built on the money for slavery. So that's really interesting if you're interested in that story. And local people are interviewed in that. It's an interesting one. Then I discovered something about here from the history workshop in the UK, slavery and Australian colonisation. So interesting to follow this one up, because there are fascinating links that many of us possibly didn't realise, or even realise that there were African people who'd spent time in the US fighting, who then went to the UK and then ended up being transported to Australia in the first fleet. So there's some interesting stories linked there. And this plea came to me, and it would be great if you want to look this up. Apparently there's an issue about the Black British History MA at Goldsmiths, and so the Black British History group, so include the Institute of Commonwealth Studies and others, asked if folks can please write to express their concern that there's a thought that this course might be might not run in future. So that's another interesting link. I also found out something about Lawrence Westcott, but then I couldn't find what it was, so apologies for that. And I'm just flagging this up again because Bewdley's Black History Tour just looks amazing. This is from my home county of Worcestershire. And I just hope that the River Severn's gone down now because they had dreadful flooding. So I'm hoping when things steady down in Bewdley, we'll be able to hear about Bewdley's anti-racist organisation who produced this Black History walking tour. Okay, so I've just whizzed through those quickly so that you were able to have that information if you need it. If you need any further information, let me know. Now, we've got lots of comments in the chat, so let's just go back over those. Yeah, Jim, thank you. You said thank you to Richard. Great presentation, lots of new information. Yeah, Unita said, Richard, that was fascinating. Richard gave us the link with freedomnarratives.org, and thanks us all for comments and questions. And Elizabeth Williams is also from Guyana, Jim. So we've got a Guyanese link going on around here. And yeah, and Robert Moore saying Goldsmiths Management are trying to close the Black Studies work. The pushback for the initiatives that have followed perhaps with the Black Lives Matter campaign since George Floyd's murder. It's interesting, we've heard from Professor Sir Jeff Palmer about the pushback that he got in Edinburgh. Unita says she signed up for this event, it's unmissable, have had to cancel a dinner. Okay. Okay, and Elizabeth Williams from Goldsmiths is moving up to Edinburgh University in the summer. Oh, right, okay, well, we definitely must get her involved too. And Unita has given us the excellent link. Thank you, Unita, you've put it onto the chat for me. So that's the link, if you can cut and paste that, if you want to join Professor Sir Hilary Beckles and that brilliant team. Yeah, it is going to be an unmissable session. I'm not sure how many people they're going to allow to join on Zoom, and I signed up fairly quickly, but I couldn't get the word out to folks. Okay, well, thank you very much indeed. And so I'm just going to ask Simon to wrap up the recording, and then we can just introduce a few other colleagues who are here. Thank you very much indeed. Thanks, Simon.